everyone. Welcome to RUSI. I'm Karen von Hippel, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today. In particular, our party representatives to the first of 3 debates we're hosting at RUSI on defense and security over the next few weeks. Today's debate is obviously on defense, and we're looking forward to hearing from the party platforms on issues such as the future of NATO, military intervention in Syria, whether or not there will be another SDSR, or even questions about the budget itself. The next debate after this one is on May 30th, and that's on foreign affairs. And then on June 2nd will be our 3rd debate on home affairs. So if you would like more information on that, please go to the website. I think most of you know RUSI is an independent think tank focused on defense and security issues. We're also nonpartisan, and that's why I'm grateful that we have a journalist here tonight chairing our discussion. So special thanks to Mark Urban, BBC Newsnight's diplomatic and defense editor, for chairing tonight's discussion. So over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Karen. Well, welcome to you, and welcome also to the audience who are joining us on the live stream on Facebook and on RUSI's own website. The format today is that we'll have a 2-minute opening statement from each of the party spokespeople, and then we'll go into the familiar question time format. I have had some questions submitted in advance, mainly from RUSI people, I have to say, but I mean, of course, we will open it up to anyone who wants to ask a question, and hopefully, given that we have 90 minutes, there'll be time for all of the key issues to be thrashed out. So I'd like to introduce our panel in alphabetical order, I should say. Firstly with Harriett Baldwin, who's the Defence Procurement Minister. Then Nia Griffiths, who is the Labour Shadow Defence Secretary. Rebecca Johnson from the Green Party, who has a background in academic research into the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and also worked in the UN with weapons inspection.
But I'm the spokesperson for the Green Party on security, peace and defence.
Brendan O'Hara from the SNP. His constituency includes the Faslane base, obviously vital strategic importance to the nation. And then finally Lord Wallace, who was part of the defence team during the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. Obviously, he's a Lib Dem. So if I could start by asking you, Harriett, to give your opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. Every minute of every hour of every week and every year of the last 48 years, the UK has had a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent hiding undetected somewhere in the world, protecting our nation. The Conservative Party and the Conservative Manifesto is the only party at this election that can give people the reassurance that we would renew that deterrent and that we would build 4 new dreadnought submarines. To my right, you will have a range of different points of view, but none of them would give you the certainty that you require in terms of commitment to that continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. In fact, most of the parties to my right are actively campaigning against that. The Conservative Manifesto at this election is one where we commit not only to spending the NATO 2% on defence in every year of the next Parliament, but also adds an additional lock of an increase of 0.5% in real terms in every year of the next Parliament. We also have committed to the £178 billion equipment plan outlined in the 2015 SDSR, which means that in terms of this general election, if you care about defence, you need to think about only one fact. When you wake up on the 9th of June, who do you want to be in charge of the nation's defences? Is it the strong and stable leadership of Theresa May and the Conservative Party, or is it Jeremy Corbyn in charge of our armed forces, which he has vowed that he'd like to see abolished, in charge of our defence spending, which he has said recently he would like to reduce, or in charge of Trident, which he actively voted last year not to renew?
Thank you so much. You got out with 7 seconds to spare. I should say that if any of you has the urge to tweet or refer to the events on social media, it's hashtag RUSIDebate17 is the one you should be using. Nia Griffith.
Well, thank you very much. For Labour, the defence and security of the nation will always be our top priority. We remain fully committed to NATO, the cornerstone of our defence policy, and to spending at least 2% of GDP on defence, as we have consistently done when in government. And we remain committed to the Trident nuclear deterrent, the 4 submarines. Our defence would be nothing without the brave men and women who serve in our armed forces. Their loyalty and professionalism is second to none. The Conservatives have slashed our army by a quarter, tried massaging the figures and missed their target of 82,000. They have no plan to increase recruitment and stem the historically high outflow of personnel. But Labour values our armed forces. We are lifting the blanket 1% freeze on public sector pay so we can give the Armed Forces Pay Review Body the greater flexibility they need to ensure competitive rates for our armed forces. And we will drive up standards in service accommodation and take action where private companies have failed to deliver. Labour will ensure that our veterans across the country get the support they need to secure jobs, housing and prompt access to healthcare. And we will take firm action to protect our service personnel and veterans from vexatious legal claims. Tory incompetence and their obsession with putting short-term monetary targets before long-term value for money has cost the taxpayer billions. We've seen 3.4 billion wasted by scrapping the Nimrod, apprentices laid off in our shipyards and uncertainty in our defence industry. Labour will develop a defence industrial strategy which supports UK research and development as well as UK manufacturing. Labour is ambitious for our defence capabilities and serious about the emerging threats that we face. We will ensure that the UK is at the cutting edge of defence thinking and technology, working with our international allies to tackle the global threats and keep our citizens safe.
Thank you so much. Also, under your 2 minutes, this is marvellous. Can I call upon you, Rebecca?
Thank you. It'll be no surprise that the Green Party puts human and environmental security at the heart of our national and international policies, including defence. So we want a strategic security and defence review that flows from that. We argue for our defence services to be better integrated, equipped and trained to carry out realistic and necessary roles that give priority to defensive defence, preventive defence, civil defence and environmental defence, which includes peace building, humanitarian support and disaster relief at home and abroad. The Green Party argues for defence resources to be focused on real threats and realistic future security threat assessments, not outdated vanity projects based on status and a deluded notion that we should punch above our weight. For prioritising war prevention and humanitarian roles as part of a cooperative security approach, we would include engaging more women in early warning, disarmament, peace building, reintegration and political reconstruction roles. For halting, we argue for halting arms sales and military equipment to oppressive regimes that target civilians and violate human rights. And to end our dangerous double standards on nuclear weapons, we would cancel Trident renewal and join current UN negotiations to bring about multilateral nuclear disarmament by concluding a strong and effective nuclear prohibition treaty, accelerating the elimination of these barbaric weapons of mass destruction. Greens want better provision to look after service personnel and veterans and their families, including post-traumatic stress counselling and training for peacetime jobs where required. And we call for defence diversification to increase UK jobs and skills in technologies for real security, such as tackling climate, cyber and terrorist threats, and also to help the world implement cooperative security and international law, including verifying disarmament and the non-proliferation treaty regimes.
Thank you so much for that green perspective. Brendan O'Hara, the SNP.
Thank you. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that the United Kingdom's obsession with being a nuclear power is economically unsustainable. And it is, in fact, I would argue, increasingly undermining our ability to perform our basic strategic responsibilities. The UK is situated on the high north and the Arctic, and it's regarded as one of the strategic hotspots in the world, yet so skewed are our priorities in the United Kingdom that we've neglected the high north to such an extent we don't have a single naval ship based north of Plymouth. And we will go 10 years without having adequate maritime patrol aircraft. it's increasingly clear that the United Kingdom cannot afford to both fulfil its strategic responsibilities to our neighbours in the north and be a nuclear power. The economy simply will not allow it. And now that we face a shrinking post-Brexit economy with a ring-fenced budget for Trident that will consume even greater amounts of that defence budget, it's becoming a crisis. So we believe it's essential that whichever wing of the pro-Trident lobby is elected in June, it's essential that we have a new SDSR brought before Parliament, one which reflects the economic and political realities in which we find ourselves in. Realities which include the fact that the Army is at an all-time low, that the contract for the Type 26 frigates hasn't been signed, and there is still no national shipbuilding strategy. Years of mismanagement, coupled to an obsession with being a nuclear power, was always going to be unsustainable. And no matter how much the UK parties might want to, they can't have both. And given their loud and unequivocal support for Trident, they've got to come clean and admit that it's our conventional forces and our conventional capabilities that will pay the price. And when the Secretary of State says we need to be more efficient about the way we work, you don't need the nuclear codes to work out what he's actually saying. He's saying that there are going to be cuts, and those cuts are going to be to our conventional capabilities. And I think it's incumbent on the government to tell us where those cuts are going to fall.
Thank you very much from the SNP perspective. And finally, Lord Wallace, the Lib Dems.
Defence policy should start from foreign policy. But the UK at present has no coherent foreign policy. Ministers have pledged that we are returning east of Suez without explaining what strategy that serves. The Prime Minister has declared that we are leaving the EU, but we are not leaving Europe, but has given us no idea what that means in terms of post-Brexit defence and security cooperation. The rhetoric is of Britain standing alone from the Conservatives, though the reality is that we work with others to face common threats and that we depend on going on working with them. Liberal Democrats understand that the threats we face are shared with our neighbours and are most effectively met by close cooperation with them. That means maintaining and strengthening Franco-British cooperation, negotiating continued association with bilateral and multilateral European defence and security mechanisms, and supporting closer coordination between NATO and the EU. The UK's defence budget is constrained by the costs of simultaneous major procurement commitments, aircraft carriers, F-35s, the deterrent, which the decline in our exchange rate have made more expensive. We share the commitment to maintaining a 2% of GDP contribution to defence spending, but we recognise that this will not meet all the demands of our defence programme, particularly if the terms of Brexit lead to a British recession. We therefore call for post-Brexit SDSR to adjust priorities to new circumstances. We are concerned that manpower should not be cut further to fund equipment that may then lack the qualified staff to maintain and use it, so we propose golden handshakes of 10,000 a person to attract STEM qualified graduates and rewards for long service personnel in free, further or higher education. We expect peacekeeping, conflict prevention and post-conflict reconstruction to continue to demand British contributions, especially in Africa, and see balancing that demand against containing Russia as the major challenge for future defence planning.
What we're going to attempt to do, and this is usually a Canute-like endeavour on the part of chairs, but we're going to try and structure things a bit in the sort of nature of what are the armed forces for, through to the issue, of course, of do we need another review, resources, balancing the books or whatever, and if we could try and leave the very sort of platform-specific stuff, once we've talked about the purpose of the forces, the budgetary climate and allocation of priorities, and then we get into all the sort of down in the weeds about F-35Bs versus other bits and pieces and all the rest of it. I'm very interested in the show of hands. I was interested that Rebecca Johnson was the only person who mentioned climate change as a security threat. Could you raise your hands if you agree that it is a threat to national security? I would say about 50 or just under 50%. Interesting, fascinating. Okay, I'm going to call on Peter Roberts from RUSI to ask the first question.
Thanks very much to all the speakers. The current expeditionary interventionist posture of the UK Armed Forces is designed to counter threats across the spectrum of conflict. But it hasn't achieved a decisive outcome in any of those since 2001. Given, therefore, that the concept of the force is flawed, and according to the NAO and others, that it's unaffordable, what should the UK Armed Forces be aspiring to be? What's the big idea from each of the parties about what they're about?
Harriett Baldwin.
Well, thank you, Peter. I would sort of draw your attention to the Strategic Defence and Security Review in 2015, which I think set out in a very clear way the range of different threats that there are in the world at the moment, and the increasingly uncertain situation that we find ourselves in a number of different theatres. And so the Security Defence and the Strategic Defence and Security Review and the Equipment Plan are both designed to look ahead over the next decade, look ahead in terms of the range of different threats that the country might face, to ensure that we always put that primary task of defending the homeland and our overseas territories at the forefront, but recognising that NATO is the cornerstone of our defence, and that there will be many things where we will want to work with NATO, to the point that Lord Wallace made about international engagement. The view of the Conservative Party is that the vote to leave the European Union was one to leave the legal structures of the European Union, but in terms of defence, it was a vote to step out into a more global world and not to step back, and that the collaboration that we have with European countries in a range of different defence projects, whether bilaterally or multilaterally in the case of Typhoon and the A400M, is incredibly important and something that we remain strongly committed to. But there was also money, additional money allocated, for example, to cyber defences and to other security measures.
Yeah, can I ask you, but I'll just bolt on a bit to Peter's question. When he talks about the not achieving a decisive outcome in any recent campaign, I guess that's a reference to Iraq and Afghanistan, which were essentially conducted under a Labour government. I mean, do you think within your party the appetite for that type of mission has now gone? And in terms of what the forces are for, is it for training for the so-called near-peer adversary, Russia or other states like that, as the primary aim of the armed forces?
If I can just pick up the point that you make on Iraq, I think the recent work that we've been doing together with Iraq has shown that there can be a very positive way forward when we're working together in collaboration with the Iraqi government. And I think that is an example where, in some ways, perhaps we've come full circle, where people quite rightly questioned whether there was a sufficient exit strategy at the time, are now saying we cannot walk by on the other side. And there is a very important role for our armed forces in actually making sure that we do deal with Daesh, because Daesh is a direct threat to us here in the UK. And that's got to be the fundamental starting point, that where there is a threat to us here in the UK, then clearly we need to have our forces to defend us. Now, we are used to, in historic contexts, the idea of state against state. We are facing a very different form of threat now, and we have to have very different strategies to deal with it. And I think, first and foremost, we do have to have very close collaboration with our NATO allies, because these threats are global. We don't know where they will appear next, and whether it is climate change in sub-Saharan Africa, which is forcing people into the hands of the likes of Daesh because they see that as the only alternative, or they are being paid to take part in such things. We have to watch where these threats are emerging, and we have to work with our allies to make sure that we deal with them effectively, and that we keep our armed forces focused very fully on those things that will defend us here in the UK.
Rebecca, same question to you, but if I once again may just bolt a bit on. I mean, a lot of times when one's looked at Green Party statements about defence, one gets the sense essentially that what the party wants is a sort of home defence force, a terror just basically defending the UK. Is that fair comment, or do you see other broader international engagements as being part of the mission of the armed forces?
I think that the Green Party is in the process still of actually trying to analyse what the security threats are, how climate change is going to affect our security in a variety of different kinds of ways, and also how Brexit, frankly, is also going to, I think, have a security impact. And I think your question goes to the heart of that. So that's why I mentioned those 4 roles for what we call the defence services, because we want to emphasise that, these men and women that were sent to fight wars that had not been sanctioned by the UN and sanctioned by international law, and then not equipped appropriately, and many died or suffered horrendous injuries, which is still impacting on their families. I've been to Shrivenham and talked to members of our different defence services about the kinds of roles. They feel betrayed by what you've identified as being a kind of wars for the wrong reason that they then loyally went and did their very best in. So we're involved as the Green Party in kind of consulting with those defence services about the kinds of roles for the security threats we'll actually have to face. And that's why I emphasise the defensive defence, which is more than just home defence. The preventive defence, which is actually about having some of our highly skilled, highly trained people being able to look at where conflicts are about to arise. And this is also why we talked about working more closely with women on the ground, because the UN has done a lot of studies that show that women on the ground start to recognise when collapse and disruption is beginning, when instability is beginning to collapse into conflict. Civil defence and environmental defence. And we see this as being about disaster relief and peacemaking. These are active roles but in which expeditionary forces that primarily are for the purposes of the use of force are kind of the very, very last resort in all of this. There's a lot that we have, the skills, the equipment, the logistics, talents, the brilliant people who can do these diverse roles that prevent war or mitigate the kinds of causes like the migration pressures and starvation that sends people leaving their own home countries.
Thank you. I mean, it's fascinating, the last resort phrase. I'm not sure anyone on the platform would argue the use of force should be the first resort, but let's continue with Brendan and your view on the purpose of forces. I mean, if I may be crude about it, a lot of the discourse one gets from the SNP just seems to be about how much money is going into Scottish shipyards, the base communities, Faslane, Lossiemouth. In your opening presentation, you mentioned, which I saw some people raising an eyebrow about surface ships and were any based north in the northern part of the country. I mean, what are the armed forces for, Brendan, shall we say, prior to the assumption of Scottish independence, if that happens, and apart from contributing to the Scottish economy?
I think the armed forces have an absolutely vital role to play in the defence of the country, and they have a vital role to play internationally and collaboratively. I think the problem that we have had, certainly in the last decade or 2 decades, is that the armed forces have been used almost as an arm of government to pursue globally government policy. And I think it's done so unilaterally, and I think it has abjectly failed to do so. And I think the UK has to decide whether it will continue with the pretense of being a global power, which its economy cannot sustain, or it becomes a reliable partner with either partners in the High North or partners in Europe or partners in NATO. I think there has to be a complete change of thinking on the part of government as to what the armed forces are for. And I think that what I would like to see, obviously I'm an advocate of Scottish independence. I believe that Scottish independence will come, but while we remain part of the United Kingdom, I would long that there is a change of thinking within the United Kingdom, within the political parties in the United Kingdom, which says it is better to be part of a collective rather than indulge in this sort of unilateral action. And so part of NATO part of the United Nations and
UK
part of the
economy is not big enough
European
to
Union.
sustain our
And I think that the
forces. What would
damaging
Scotland be able
economic
to
consequences of
sustain as an
Brexit,
independent country?
not just the economy of the damaging economics of Brexit, but the damage to the reputation caused by Brexit are going to undermine the United Kingdom for many, many years to come.
Particularly on things like shipbuilding.
I didn't hear the interruption.
Well,
Sorry,
if
Harriett.
the UK economy can't sustain defence at its current level, what on earth could the Scottish economy sustain in Scotland? I mean,
So if the UK economy,
That was your argument.
the UK economy cannot afford to be a nuclear power and a conventional power. And Harriet, you talk about, as if there is a bottomless pit of money. The fact that we haven't seen a national shipbuilding strategy, which is 18 months late, the fact that the Type 26s are still, the contract still hasn't been signed on them, the fact that the National Audit Office are saying that the procurement plan is unaffordable. There are 101 examples where the United Kingdom government have abjectly failed the conventional forces of this country because you are obsessed with remaining a nuclear power which you cannot afford to be.
If you want ships built on the Clyde and you want Type 26 to start this summer,
I'll tell
then
you
you
what,
need to elect
Harriet,
a Conservative government.
I will take no lessons whatsoever from a Conservative government who promised during the referendum that we would have 13 Type 26s built in the Clyde, a promise that lasted 20 minutes until it was 8, and there still hasn't been steel cut on a single Type 26. You have betrayed the workers in the Clyde, and you're betraying them again, and no one is going to fall for it this time.
Lord Wallace, quickly on the core missions. What are the armed forces
I'd like
for?
to ask
and then we'll go back to the question of how we
ask the
resource
audience
them.
how far they see migration and the flow of refugees from failed states' civil conflict as a security threat.
Okay,
to Britain,
well,
because
show of hands.
that's a large challenge for how we respond. How many do think that's a major threat for Britain?
Migration, yeah. I would say, if anything, maybe slightly more than climate change, but
No,
about
well,
half.
of course, they're not entirely unconnected.
No, absolutely. Does that
Because
help?
I think, to answer the question directly, I think the age of direct intervention of the sort that we had in Iraq is over, partly because the Middle East has become so incredibly complicated. The Middle East is now also very heavily armed. 60% of British arms exports go to the Gulf states, and the United States has just signed another huge agreement on arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Do we really want to go in to a region where the domestic players have got our most advanced weapons to use for whatever peculiar purposes they may be pursuing? I'd just like to support Brendan on one thing. We have more ships deployed to protect the borders and the maritime waters of Bahrain than we do have for the whole of northern Britain. And that's part of the oddity and peculiarity of British defence policy at the present moment. In terms of what we need, it does seem to me that we need forces that are capable of containing Russia, but we also need forces that can help to patrol the Mediterranean, the coast of Africa, and to help in civil reconstruction, conflict prevention across the Sahel, in East Africa. And none of those things are things that we need to do alone. Indeed, we shouldn't be doing them alone, but they are things that we should be working with others to do as closely as possible.
Now, you've mentioned Russia there. Lincoln Pigman, is that right? From King's, had a question. He's at the back there, yeah.
So the debate on the Russian threat has largely been framed in terms of selective cooperation and resisting Russian subversion in other areas, or total isolation. How would the parties present approach the Russian threat, and to what extent would they be open to selective cooperation on issues such as counterterrorism?
And before we plunge into that, Brendan, can I just ask you, because in your opening statement you mentioned Arctic matters and a sense, certainly in the Nordic countries, of being under threat from Russia. Do you share that, and what in concrete terms do you think could be done to address it in terms of the mission of the armed forces? And then we'll go on to Lincoln's broader point.
So I think that, well, we certainly share the concern of a resurgent Russia and its activities in the high north and the Arctic. But the Nordic countries, I don't think you can say that they share a common vision or a common level of fear with Russia. I mean, Denmark varies massively from Norway, for example. But I think what we have is a responsibility to our Nordic neighbours to be part of that coalition in the north which protects everybody, and I don't think we're currently doing that. The fact that the Canadians, the French and the Americans have all had to chip in over the last 7 or 8 years when since the Nimrods have been chopped up, doesn't behove very well on the current government or the previous government. So what I'm saying is that how can we be serious about being good regional allies and partners when we are abdicating and have abdicated responsibility to our coastline and our back door, when we have this global vision which is economically unsustainable? I think that's where our priority has to be.
Thank you. Harriett, going back to the question there, Russia, near peer adversary to be, or a country we ought to be cooperating with, both? I mean, what's your sense of how far the Russian threat, if we can call it that, now informs defence spending and policy?
Well, again, going back to the Strategic Defence and Security Review in 2015 and indeed in subsequent speeches, the Defence Secretary has made it very clear that this is a key issue in terms of our defence spending, basically because in 2014 Russia committed an act of aggression in the Ukraine. And that means that in terms of NATO has agreed steps in terms of forward deployment, and obviously UK troops very actively engaged in that. And so we would seek to resolve that particular issue before we felt that we were able to be in a position where we did not see Russian strategic aims as very contrary to our own strategic defence and security priorities.
Neil Griffith.
Well, quite clearly, we need to take the Russian threat very seriously. And of course, there are many new emerging threats, such as the cyber security, which we need to make sure that we keep up to date with and keep up to speed with. In terms of clearly, the situation we face at the moment, we do need to give reassurance to all our NATO partners that we are at one in NATO and we are going to be working with them and protecting them. It's never good, though, to isolate a country, and where there are opportunities to develop diplomatic relations with Russia, where we can work together in parts of the world, then we need to be working on that in the same way as psychologically it is never good to put somebody down in a very unpleasant manner. So we do need to understand Putin's psychology. We do need to understand about his game that he's playing with his own internal politics. So we do need to approach things very carefully and very diplomatically, but it would be wrong to cut off all relations where we can have a rapport, but we do need to be absolutely firm and absolutely strong that we are not going to stand for any aggression against NATO from Russia. And I think that we need to be very, very firm on that.
And you made news on Friday in terms of voicing a commitment to renew Trident. Is Trident basically about Russia for you?
Well, I think in many respects it can be seen as such, but I think now when you look at places like North Korea, I think people are looking at other areas of the world where there are these emerging threats and where it's very, very important that we as the UK say quite firmly that we are not going to stand for rogue states suddenly deciding to do unthinkable things, and we need to be very clear about that.
Thank you.
Leah, you voted against renewing Trident last year.
Well, I'm telling you very clearly what our Labour Party policy is, and that our policy is very clearly to keep the renewal of
your party, your shadow chancellor, you yourself, all voted against renewing Trident last year.
But I'm telling you now that I think the emerging threats that we face mean that we definitely need to keep Trident.
So
All right. Well,
we'll perhaps get into some of those
yes.
topics later.
We're going to the
I'd
next
like
sort
to
of.
respond on this Russia question because I think it's a really
If you
important
can, in
one.
brief, yeah.
Okay, because I actually collaborated with one of your RUSI colleagues, Igor Sutyagin, who's done research into the Russian tactical nuclear forces. And, you know, and then I come back from Vienna a couple of weeks ago. I was at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference where I saw the US, UK, Russia, and one or two others collaborating with each other for the sole purpose of preventing nuclear weapons actually being prohibited as part of a multilateral nuclear disarmament initiative under the UN, negotiations under the UN, to accelerate their total elimination. And it just raises a question. So what are the threats? Lord Wallace talks about containing, but how do you, the major element of what Putin is currently doing actually is things like destabilizing countries through cyber attacks. And that's where we do need to be paying a lot more attention about what our cybersecurity is. It's not Trident. Trident just collaborates with the Russians in building the value of these 20th century outdated weapons that are dependent on Windows XP. You know, that create threats for us whether or not they are intentionally used through miscalculation and accident and various other things. And I have to say, I'm sorry that you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a real opportunity to reach out through things like the OSCE, where Russia engages. And I agree with Brendan about the High Arctic Council as well. This is an important place to engage Russia in cooperative security issues. But instead of which, and largely driven by US defense contractors, NATO was pushed towards expansion that would then buy in the most high-tech US weaponry. And that encircled Russia in a way that has led to Putin having this role that is unfortunately highly popular within Russia, which is as a strong-armed man.
Thanks, Rebecca. We're going to roll in a minute onto a question that I'll invite about SCSR. Do we need a new one? And a reordering of priorities. But before we do, are there any other questions from the floor about the basic purpose of the armed forces, their missions, and would anyone like to ask a question on that? Yes, so we've got two gentlemen here.
May I raise a question which wasn't covered, although I know people on the platform there probably have strong views on it. The result of Brexit in terms of defence will mean that our closest ally, France, will be going along with the idea of developing a European defence community. What impact do they think that will have on NATO? Obviously detrimental, but also detrimental to the fact that France is in military terms, our closest ally in terms of capability. Thank you.
Excellent question. Brexit.
Yeah.
And being a power in the world, how does that change the calculation? And will the inevitable economic consequences of Brexit, as projected by many in the IFS and elsewhere in terms of lower receipt of taxes and all the rest of it, will that cause, at least temporarily, a decline in the UK ability to pay for defence?
So, as I said, our budget, our manifesto commits to 2% and a real terms increase in every year in the next Parliament. We think it's very important as the country that has the largest defence budget in Europe, and we have the second largest in NATO, that we continue to work very closely with both our European allies and our NATO allies on a range of different collaborative programs.
So
we have
what you
a
see
lot.
The impact of Euratom treaty, because
sorry,
you're talking about
Rebecca,
pulling out of that, and that has absolute direct implications.
Let's just
for the
focus on the
question
Brexit
on
question
France
for the
and
moment.
Brexit. It is Brexit. Euratom, Brexit,
I
France.
know. I'll continue membership
absolutely
or not,
connected.
but let's.
Yes, so we will continue with the new French president and the new French government, working very closely with them across a range of different collaborative defence projects, and we see no reason why our decision to leave the European Union should have any impact on that important bilateral relationship.
Lord Wallace, I just want to ask you a follow-on from the gentleman's question. a world in which countries, now you may feel it's an unlikely scenario, but take the 2% NATO pledge seriously, does mean one in which Germany spends substantially more on defence than the UK, and probably within the next few years, ditto France, could suddenly become a much bigger spender if it looks like it's going to take that seriously. So from your perspective, having been in the MOD, being a Lib Dem spokesman, does the UK still have anything special to offer Europe in terms of security leadership?
Well, I think we should be much more hesitant about saying we've got to lead in Europe or we shouldn't be there. We need to share with the French, and we need to get the French policy with the Franco-British cooperation agreements all the way through has been the British and the French trying to get the Germans, as they are moving in the right direction, to take on more responsibilities. The Eurozone economy is now growing faster than the British, I'm sure you've all noticed, so they have more money to spend on defence, and we may, if our economy slows down further, have less. Can I just quote the second sentence of the Conservative Manifesto says, Brexit will define us, our place in the world, our economic security, and our future prosperity. That's a pretty fundamental set of questions about where we're going. I don't see how, if we follow the David Davis style of negotiations, end up with a breakdown, loss of goodwill, and we're out of all those multilateral discussions, how we manage to maintain as close a relationship with the Dutch, the Italians, as well as the French and others, as we have been developing in recent years. When I was in government, I had a lot of arguments with Conservative ministers who didn't want to tell people how much we were cooperating with the French and the Germans. And we had a particular argument as to whether or not it would be a good idea to invite the press to Northwood to show them the European Command Centre for Operation Atalanta, because ministers didn't want the Daily Mail really to know about that. Now, that's part of where we've gone wrong. There's been a widening gap between the reality that we need to work closely with partners and the rhetoric that Britain stands alone, as we always have done, as we did in the Battle of Britain. We didn't have Polish pilots in the Battle of Britain, all that stuff. And that's, Harriett, part of the problem where the Conservative government now is. And I do fear that a hard Brexit will damage our relations with the French and with other European countries.
So why is it Liberal Democrat policy then to tie David Davis's hands with the promise of a second referendum ex ante as you go into a negotiation that would deeply deteriorate his negotiating position?
I'd love to tie.
I cannot understand why that is your party's policy.
Harriett, may I just following
to
up?
make the assessment when they actually see the terms and conditions that you come up with, because I don't think you are even aware of the impact of Brexit on, important treaties like Euratom Treaty that underpin the nuclear regulation across the whole of Europe, including in this country, that are not just supplied by the IAEA from Vienna. And, your question was absolutely well-founded, and I wish I had more time to talk through with you what I think some of the dangers are of that for European security. But I think we're probably wanting to move on.
Thank you
many
kindly,
thoughts,
Rebecca.
but not being aware of the issues
Harriett,
is not one of them.
Harriett, may I, in the spirit of the gentleman's question, may I just ask you about this point, that as long as the UK was in the EU, it was in a position to obstruct further defence integration that it might object to. Do you accept that, obviously, in leaving, you can no longer do that, and that it, faced with President Trump and all the rest of it, France, Germany, other European countries may well feel they want to accelerate that process?
Well, obviously, I think the point that we would continue to make is that while we're all in favour of these bilateral collaborations with the French, with the Germans, with other NATO countries, other European countries, it's very important that if the European Union chooses to move forward in terms of some kind of something they can bill as being cooperation, that it does not duplicate what is already happening at NATO headquarters, because that would be, if you're in, we are making progress in terms of getting other European countries to sign up to the 2% NATO pledge, and we don't want that money to be spent on just duplicating a bureaucracy and duplicating a headquarters. So we want that to be spent on useful equipment, cyber defences and things like
Full
that.
structured, but not double hatting people.
The problem with that is, Harriett, though, is that you have, there was no work done on Brexit, full stop. And so we are in a situation where the United Kingdom are blindly stumbling into Brexit. And you cannot pretend for a moment that, you know, anything that the 2015 SDSR was predicated on, anything other than remaining within the European Union. And therefore, it has to have changed, and therefore there has to be a new one. And we have abdicated our responsibility to Europe. And the language, the aggressive language that we are using, talking about our European partners, I'll tell you, it doesn't bode well for having to go back and work collaboratively with them post-Brexit.
Brendan,
I think you're on a very dangerous road.
This general election is not a rerun of last year's referendum. I seem to remember we had a long and heated argument last year about this issue. The country has made a decision. This election is about who do we want to be Prime Minister on June the 9th, leading a government into these negotiations to forge that deep and special relationship with our defence allies and our European
There's an entire
neighbours.
chapter in the 2015 SDSR on European cooperation, cooperation with allies. That is now risks being redundant. That's part of why we're going to need a post-Brexit SDSR.
So
Well,
one
okay,
of the terms
a
and
number of you
conditions
have
for
made that
going beyond
point.
that.
Let me call on Gwilym Williams to table the question about the 2015 SDSR. Well, I won't steal his thunder.
Thanks.
So we are moving inexorably into that territory.
It's probably covering ground that some of the panelists have already discussed. But would any of them commit to a refreshed SDSR, which is materially different to the 2015 iteration? Obviously, Brexit's been raised. Are there any other key areas they would like to reassess, given recent events?
Would you commit to a new defence review, Nia, I think?
Yes, certainly. The Brexit does make a new defence review essential. I think there are a number of issues which arise from that. First of all, we've talked on the political side, but there's also the financial side of the increased costs that we will face, potentially being outside of the EU. So yes, we certainly do need to look at the detail, we need to look at timetabling, we need to look at priorities, we need to look at what sort of mess the Conservatives leave behind in terms of no shipbuilding strategy, armed forces below par, in terms of numbers. So there is a lot to do.
Would you include the nuclear deterrent in that review?
The review for us is about the detail, it's about the timetabling, it is not about the principle of whether we have a nuclear deterrent. We are committed to the nuclear deterrent.
Harriett, can I ask you, we hear things going around in Whitehall about a feeling that the efficiency savings that were envisaged in SDSR 2015 are not deliverable, that something has to give. Once again, the programme is overset. How do you address that if you win the election?
Well, what we've done in the manifesto is I've mentioned the double lock already twice, so I won't go into the detail on that again, but we've put in 178 billion into our manifesto, and that compares to the 160 billion that was in the 2015 Conservative manifesto. So we have substantially increased the budget for the equipment plan.
James Clancy has a question, if we may get a microphone to him.
Thanks very much. Can I just highlight the cross-party complacency towards defence and security? The world is certainly more unsecure than it ever has been since 1945. It feels like we're sat in 1932, where everyone here is we're not talking about cutting budgets, we're talking about meeting the minimum NATO standards. The Conservative Party has become weak on defence. In 2010, when I was in the Royal Marines, you spent 2.8% on defence. It's now 1.9%. If you add Chelsea pensioners and MOD golf club fees, you do actually get to 2% in order to meet the NATO standard. But let me tell you, when I was fighting in Afghanistan, it was our training that helped us succeed. It's a particular incident in a counterinsurgency operation where I was fighting for 7 hours, and we couldn't use this expensive equipment that you talk of. And it came down to the training of the men and women that I was fighting alongside. You're now cutting that because of efficiency savings. So the future men and women that go and deploy overseas, whether it's peace support operations, humanitarian operations, counterinsurgency operations, they are less well prepared than when I was because of your cuts. So when are you going to become serious about defence and actually commit to spending properly and over the 2% that NATO asked for?
Harriett Baldwin.
Well, so that is our commitment in our manifesto, and there's the double lock that I mentioned. There is the 178 billion equipment plan, and we are now in a position where the defence budget is rising every year. I appreciate that when you were serving in 2010, we just inherited a terrible mess and overcommitment in terms of the Labour budget, which apparently was caused by the banks, was it, Nia? Okay, right. It was actually a hugely overcommitted defence budget, and so some difficult decisions were taken at the time. But I think over the last 7 years, we have managed to get that under control. We've managed to deliver a range of different savings, but we've also managed to get ourselves in a position where we have growing armed forces again, growing equipment budget again. And there is only one party on this stage today that you can rely on June the 8th to have that continued strong commitment to defence. Do you want to wake up on the 9th of June with Jeremy Corbyn and this coalition of chaos?
This is just rhetorical rubbish. This is a serious question from somebody who served in our defence services with bad equipment that put his life and the lives of others at risk. It was only last year when I was at Shrivenham talking to young people like you who served and who are being trained up to serve again. And this is a real problem, and you know that was 6 years after the Tories had been in power and after the coalition government. This is a very real question, and this is why, you know, what the Greens are trying to push, and I know we're not going to end up in government, but the point is that a lot of the arguments that we've been making about things like climate and security end up being gradually brought into the policies of others because they make sense. This is why we're arguing for strategic security and defence review. We want it to be holistic and root and branch, to take into account Brexit, yes, but also to take into account the inadequacies of the SR from 2015. And that's the point. We don't want a half-baked one that still considers that having nuclear weapons and renewing nuclear weapons in a context when the UN is, let me repeat, actually negotiating a treaty that will change the international legal status and therefore the political value and everything else surrounding nuclear weapons. This has to be brought into, whether a Labour, a Tory, a Lib Dem or any other. If you put security at the heart of it and you have a strategic security assessment and make a strategic security and defence review, you will begin to come up with the right kinds of answers about how we should be training and prioritising and changing the roles and working with our defence services to change the roles that we ask these brave people to do.
Thank you. Nia, can I just ask you, you've spoken about the need for a defence review if Labour win the election. In response to James's point, is that the type of review where the so-called difficult choices would be made, force structure might be cut, key programmes eliminated in order to equip the front line such as it would remain afterwards to a high standard, to a better standard? Would you be prepared to take those kinds of tough decisions?
Well, I think I'd like to thank James for sharing his experience, but emphasise very, very clearly that it is the armed forces personnel who deliver and that we value the armed forces personnel, and that's why we're saying that we lift the 1% pay freeze and that we will give the Army Pay Review Body that flexibility so that they can give better rewards, they can up salaries, and also, of course, just hang on a minute. It was training that James mentioned in particular, and we know that Harriett's been massaging the figures in terms of how many people do we now have in the army, we're talking about 75,000 actually having completed phase 1 training, but she will quote 79,000 having completed phase 1 training, but only 75,000 have completed phase 2. And it's the same story with the reserves. It is absolutely crucial that our frontline forces do get the proper training that they need, and that there are not cutbacks in that training, because quite clearly it's that expertise, that loyalty, combined with that training, which enables them to be effective. So we want to...
Where is Michael Fallon, by the way?
Yes, good question.
If you really take defence seriously, where is the Defence Secretary?
I don't know, he's a busy man.
But that's not the point.
There's a question from a lady here. Can we get a microphone?
Don't worry, I think I've got a strong enough voice. I'd like to just come back to a few first principles here. And the first principle, which a number of you, apart from Harriett, forgets, is that NATO is the cornerstone of our security, and it has been for over 70-odd years, or near enough 70-odd years, contrary to what Lord Wallace would have us believe. It is not the EU, it is NATO. It is in the context of NATO that we used to have a magnificent percentage of spending on GDP. We've now got people actually taking seriously an increase to 2%. We've now got the Germans taking it seriously. We've got the French taking it seriously. And it's in no small measure in relation to our pushing for that and our continued pushing, and maybe we'd be able to push a little further in the future. I'd also like to take issue with the question of the nuclear deterrent, which seems to be so confusing from these people on the panel. The lady from the Greens seems to have a very idealistic view of what this is about. We have an insurance policy. Nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented. We have them. We have to deal with them.
Can I ask you to... Is there a question in there?
There isn't a question. I'd just like them to get back to some first principles and understanding of the basis and cornerstone of our defence, and to say that you support the Trident missiles and the nuclear deterrent is ridiculous when you have a leader who might become Prime Minister who wouldn't even be prepared to launch them. And your party, Lord Wallace, doesn't even understand the concept of a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent.
Okay.
Can I make a
I
brief
understand
reply
that
to this?
perfectly well. Thank you very much. And I used to talk to Michael Quinlan about it. I have been involved in this area for quite a long time. Thank you. And if I may say so, NATO and the EU have been moving towards closer cooperation in wider security issues for some time. It's a Eurosceptic myth that everything is to do with NATO and the EU has nothing to do with defence and security. What's Operation Atalanta for? What are we doing in the Sahel? There are a range of areas with American encouragement in which NATO and the EU have been working more closely together. And for that matter, the membership of NATO and the EU is remarkably close. So we are now wishing to cut ourselves off from one of these pillars and hope that everyone else will do what we want in the other. Now, the question of how we continue to cooperate with our European partners after a hard Brexit in which we are pretty aggressive towards our partners and lose their sympathy, Boris Johnson's lost their sympathy already, is one that we really do have to address very seriously.
Thank you.
Can I just
question
respond
from Deborah
on,
Haynes.
May I just, because
Haynes.
this was directed directly at me in the Green policy. Deterrence, as any theorist, and many of you probably know, is not a property of any particular weapons. Remember that Saddam Hussein thought he had a chemical weapon deterrent, that al-Assad also regarded chemical weapons as his version of deterrence. Deterrence is a relationship between potential adversaries, and it relies on communication, on calculation of what each country holds valuable. It relies on communication and actually cooperation for deterrence to work. So what we have are nuclear weapons. Let's not forget that. Just like what Bashar al-Assad has are chemical weapons. And we need to recognize that these weapons, in extremis, often get used maybe by the government and maybe by someone else who gets hold of an ability to be able, through cyber perhaps.
You're worried about
so
accidental.
I want the recognition that we should be talking about Trident as a weapon. Whether or not it deters is something for evidence, and I've not seen the evidence, and I don't think any of you have.
Okay, Deborah Haynes.
Goodness me.
This is a question really for Harriett Baldwin. SDSR 2015, as it stands, is fundamentally not funded. It wasn't funded from the very beginning when it was published because it relied on efficiency savings that are unachievable. Since then, we've had Brexit, we've had the collapse in the value of the pound. There's also a long history of a failure to cost properly the support costs for the equipment, let alone the price tags for the actual pieces of kit. Can you please be honest and tell us what you're going to do about this? Is that going to mean a new chapter for 2015 SDSR, or as Mark Sedwell is pushing for with the 60-day review he's currently undertaking, an SDSR 2017? And I guess for the rest, if you want to chip in, I mean, fundamentally, the armed forces at the size and scale that we currently are supposed to be have as our ambition to achieve is not affordable unless more money is put in, fundamental reforms of defence are carried out. So are you going to cut the size of the military, especially with the Labour review, or are you going to pledge to increase substantially the amount of money that you put into defence? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Deborah. I mean, we are putting more money in, and as I mentioned, the defence budget is now growing again, and the equipment budget that we put in this manifesto is some £18 billion larger than in the previous manifesto.
Deborah's point is that just the depreciation in sterling would eat that up on the big contracts, right. F-35, Trident replacement.
Well, the pound is slightly lower than it was in SDSR 15. No, it is slightly lower. And some of our equipment is denominated in dollars. So we are hedged. For the next 3 years. We have an ongoing program of hedging. And you may be a currency guru, but I can't tell you, as someone who traded currencies for 20 years, where sterling against the dollar will be in 3 years' time. But it's prudent to keep hedging those exposures, obviously. So I'm not denying the fact that we do need to continue the program of efficiencies that we have outlined, and that's very much been something that the whole of the armed forces have been engaged with. And that money, the savings, is 100% ploughed back into this ambitious equipment program that we have. It's not something that is in the manifesto. I would hope that we will have one on this regular cycle.
Brendan, to be fair, you've been saying unaffordable since virtually your first words on this platform.
Absolutely.
Now, is for you the scrapping of Trident replacement a sort of panacea in this regard, or would you be ready to make hard choices and cut force structure in order to afford defence within the kind of budget that's being envisaged?
Okay. Let me be absolutely clear, unequivocally, that I don't think there is a moral, economic or military argument for Trident. So I will always oppose nuclear weapons. But what I'm asking the audience here to consider is, at what cost are you prepared to hold on to your nuclear weapons? Because you cannot do it at the current 2%. I mean, Harriet's tinkering at the edges here, and she's tinkering at the edges because the truth is unpalatable to her. And the truth is, you would have to, if you want strong conventional defences, exactly as this country requires, and you want to be a nuclear power, then you're going to have to increase military spending to 2.5%, 3%, 3.5%, 4%, 4.5%. You're going to have to increase military spending, and then what that comes down to is political choices, because that money will then come out of your welfare budget, it'll come out of your social care budget, and it will hurt ordinary people. And that's why I say I don't think there's an economic argument for it, but you and this audience have got to decide where your priorities lie. My priorities are for a strong, conventional, well-funded defence that does not include Trident. And you cannot have both, and you most certainly cannot have both by tinkering at the edges with, what do you call them, efficiency savings, which already have fallen flat in their face. So there's hard choices coming for this country, and you better decide whether you're going to hugely increase military spending at the cost of your social budget, or you're going to have to choose between being a nuclear power or being a conventional power.
But we also have to have clear accounting about the 2%, because we consistently spent more than 2% when we were in government. And what we've seen recently, if we've seen a Conservative government move the goalposts, include things like pensions, which we didn't include in 2010. Now, I'm saying to you that a Labour government would go back to that form of calculation, the 2010 form of calculation, a proper 2%, and that we would be spending at least 2% on defence, not shilly-shallying around like the Conservatives have done, going down to 1.9% and trying to put in other bits and pieces to try and pretend that it's 2%.
Then where is your budget for renewing Trident in the face of a UN treaty? You can't do them both. I mean, Brendan is absolutely right. So do you, and Gordon Brown didn't want you to go and get that extra pot from the Treasury, which ended up being the fudge.
Follow the NATO rules in terms of defence spending. Do you agree with your leader, who is trying to be Prime Minister of this country, when he said in 2016, I would like us to live in a world where we spend a lot less on defence?
We are very firmly committed to spending at least 2% on defence, and that is from our Shadow Chancellor, our Treasury team, fully backing that, I can assure you.
Thank you. This gentleman has a question.
Josh Arnold Forster, member of the Institute. Could you describe or give us an assessment of both the scale and the nature of the resistance you might encounter from your Whitehall and Westminster colleagues, especially those in numbers 10 and 11, if in the eventuality you do decide you would need to spend significantly more than 2% of our GDP to make good the gaps that this audience is very well aware of?
I would say back to Neil, although of course you wouldn't accept that you would be spending significantly more than 2%.
Well, I'm saying that we consistently did in government, and I think one's record in government is what you should look at.
Okay,
we're talking about
so
2.6, 2.7, 2.5%. Consistently when we were in government, we spent more. And we're very clear about what has gone wrong with the Conservatives over the past 7 years, that they didn't put growth into the economy, they didn't build the economy up. We are a very rich country. The fact that we don't distribute it correctly, and we do have poverty, and we do have people struggling, is a political decision. It's not because we're not rich. We can afford to do things, and we should afford to do them.
And coming back to his question, there you are across the cabinet table from Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. Is defence a tough sell for those two gentlemen when you're asking for a proper 2%?
Well, I think I would say several things there. First of all, I would say that John McDonnell has already agreed that we need to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence, and that is a firm commitment from us as a party. And then I would also say that our leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has always got the welfare of the armed forces at his heart, and I know that he would want to make sure that they were properly remunerated for the work that they do.
The Prime Minister has said several times that she wants lower taxes. And if you want lower taxes, when the population in this country is getting older, which means health spending is going up, pensions cost more, and when actually the cuts in education and training spending mean that we are pulling in skilled workers from elsewhere because we haven't got enough skilled workers ourselves, which is part of the pull factor in immigration, then there isn't going to be any more money for defence if you cut taxes. If we're all saying, actually we recognise we have to have higher taxes in order to be able to spend more on defence as well as that, then let's be honest about that and say that's where we're going. Because we can't, as the Conservatives are promising, cut taxes further. They are, of course, already cutting school budgets and other such things, and at the same time promise they're going to spend more on defence, because the two simply don't add up.
Okay, I'd like, if we can, in the time that remains, to look at some of those perennial hard choices. If there seems to be a consensus in the room, or at least a strong feeling, that a government will inevitably end up in some sort of exercise of trying to adjust money and defence, and call it a new review, call it a new chapter, call it whatever you will, Sedwill formula, call it what you will. But what should those choices be? Now, clearly, some on the platform would say, well, look, if you get rid of Trident replacement, that makes a big difference, gives you a lot of room for manoeuvre in the budget. But I think we should also look at some of the other options. Now, John Gillam, I believe, has a question.
the total number of Royal Naval frigates and destroyers has reduced from 33 in 2000 to 19 today. In the light of the Commons Defence Committee report in November 2016, which concluded that the fleet is now way below the critical mass required for the many tasks which could confront it if the international scene continues to deteriorate, would you support a significant expansion of the number of frigates and destroyers?
Harriett.
Yes, thank you. What we've committed to in the manifesto is that we would obviously want to retain the 19 that we have. That means that we need to start the programme of building the new Type 26s this summer. That is what we're on track to do. And in terms of our manifesto, we have obviously outlined the fact that there are 2 new aircraft carriers which are going to be completed in the next few years. Obviously the largest warships that the Royal Navy has ever had. And thirdly, that we are going to publish this national shipbuilding strategy, which sadly we're not able to do during PERDA, Brendan. It will enable the Royal Navy to have a growing number of frigates and destroyers by the 2030s. That's the wording that we've put in the manifesto.
A growing number.
Yeah.
Okay, so in theory, John, you should be happy. Can I just ask you, Anya, to what extent do you think it's desirable for more of that shipbuilding to take place south of the border with Scotland?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, Anya. Is there a need for a rebalancing as part of this shipbuilding strategy?
As someone who is a passionate believer in a United Kingdom, I am a huge fan of the shipbuilding talents that we have both at Rosyth and on the Clyde. And I would hope that we would continue to build them there.
Well, yes, but
And we should certainly use the expertise of the shipyards that we have and the personnel that we have. And one of the problems with this Conservative government has been the stop-start approach, which has actually cost the taxpayer billions because there's been indecision and delays, and that ends up then costing us a lot more. So it's very important that we keep the continuity and that we keep the use of the expertise that we have now in those shipyards.
Lee Willett.
Lee Willett from James, thank you. And thank you, Chairman, for the chance to intervene on this. One of the, as I understand it correctly, one of the main principles of the commitment to increasing the numbers of destroyers and frigates is on the affordability of the General Purpose Future Frigate Programme, so getting those down to cost and also being able to sell some of them to overseas as an export. I wondered if the Minister would care to comment on what the strategy is for making the sale of those GPFFs effective and viable so that we will sell some, we'll make them more affordable, we'll bring some more money in, and we'll answer the question of how we're going to build the flotilla numbers. Thank you.
More sales, easy to say, hard to do, I think, given the recent performance of the British defence industry on major equipments.
Well, we actually think that, and this is, I can't obviously tell you what's going to be in the National Shipbuilding Strategy during PERDA, but we've commissioned from Sir John Parker an excellent report which is in the public domain. And we have also worked very closely with the Defence and Security Organisation in the Department for International Trade. And it is very much the case that over the next decade, we see demand for frigates in particular, significant demand for frigates over the next decade. And what we want to be able to achieve is something that delivers what the Royal Navy wants, but also is priced at a competitive price point that will be attractive in the global market for frigates. And we are very confident that the fantastic and up-to-date design that we have, for example, with the Type 26 is one that other countries also might look at. So I think there's a range of different ways in which we can increase what is already a strong game in terms of exporting around the world and add in ships into that equation.
So one of the things that we need to do, of course, is make sure that we get the money for the service contracts. It seems to me that we have seen importing of things to this country, whereby the service contracts remain with the country exporting it to us. And yet when we have exported elsewhere, we have not been actually taking advantage of our people doing those service contracts for those vessels abroad.
Brendan, can I I mean, we have been talking about shipbuilding strategy quite a bit. Is it in the UK's national interest that all its submarines should be based on the Clyde and that so much of its major warship tonnage should be built in Scotland?
Well, I think the reason that the Clyde and Rosyth is used as extensively as it is because it's clearly the best place to do it. It's clearly the best workforce on which to carry it out. So it makes absolute sense on every level to do it at on the Clyde and at Rosyth. The question about the Type 31 or the Type 31E, as they've become known, is there's been absolutely no clarity on what these frigates are going to be. We haven't seen a design, we haven't seen costings for them. They're sort of out there in the ether. You know, they were, as I recall, they weren't even in the SDSR. They were an addendum, a verbal addendum, which the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, put in and saying, you know, and just came up with this exportable Type 31. So how we're going to get from the design stage through a build stage, through the costing stage to actually get them exported, I've yet to find out. And the Type 26s, I mean, as far as I understand, they were never designed for export. And they're never designed for export because they're far too expensive to export because of the amount of equipment that is on the Type 26s. And you know, Harriett says, you know, it is in the National Shipbuilding Strategy. We've been waiting almost a year for the National Shipbuilding Strategy. You know, every time I have asked about the National Shipbuilding Strategy, I'm told, you know, it'll be out soon, and then I'm told it's already been out, and then I'm told, actually, Sir John Parker's report wasn't the National Shipbuilding Strategy, it'll be out in the winter, it'll be out in the spring, and now I'm being told that we can't talk about it because of Purda. Now, we need
actual shipbuilding, though, in Scotland.
We
So there are
need,
5 offshore patrol
but, you know,
vessels that are being built.
we have been waiting for this National Shipbuilding Strategy for almost a year. And how can the workers on the Clyde or Rosyth or investors or companies have any faith in this government when it can't even fess up to the fact that it has failed to deliver a national shipbuilding strategy that was promised a year ago?
Okay, this gentleman and then that lady.
I'm afraid I'm going to bring things back to operational capability because that's what matters to people in the front line. And not a lot of people know that. This is about the only place where you can get information about what's going on the front line. Yes, there are Forces TV, which I commend to everybody. Anyway, I'm going to give the example of a sailor because I was one. Sailors in the Royal Navy today are stretched to compete their current peacetime tasks, due, unfortunately, to pitiful past procurement and insufficient people to actually operate all their assets. This, of course, applies to all the armed forces. Parliament has reported numerous operational capability shortfalls, particularly in the Maritime Division of Defence, whose resolution is proposed by the Conservative Party in the future. Therefore, I want to talk about the people today. Immediate challenges for our sailors are in the areas of readiness, very low, responsiveness, well, they haven't got much background and backup to be able to respond. Resilience, our breakdown and operational capability for some of our important assets is pathetic and reputational. Our allies, who used to think of the Royal Navy in particular as being the best in the world, are now not. So my question is it not time to conduct an informed, informative, and truthful debate or to address the defence difficulties so that the public can be reassured that the defence budget is adequate to the task? SDSR did not do that, and in most of it, it was much more classified than SDSR 10. The public is not known, and therefore we'll be able in the public to be able to know that the money is being wisely spent and that our sailors and servicemen are given the resources to do the job so that they are safely doing.
So we can understand that. When you say a debate, a national debate, do you mean effectively an emergency SDSR or something like that?
I mean an emergency SDSR, but I also mean more interest. The public don't really care much about defence. There's no votes.
We can't force them.
I know we can't, but at least we can tell them the truth. We can get people like Deborah Hayne to be able to actually write what's actually out there, to say to us that our submarines are not operational, etc.
Lord Wallace, the urgency of this issue...
I think there's a severe danger that we're heading towards a situation in which the sheer weight of equipment on the budget leads to shrinking personnel, and we end up with too few well-trained and well-qualified people to operate what we've got. And that's been exacerbated by the public sector pay freeze, as we know, and therefore the problem of less retention of really well-trained staff. That's there for all the services, we know. And that's certainly part of where we need to say, for the next SDSR, personnel matters as much as equipment.
If not more.
And we're in severe danger of getting the balance wrong. I listened to Harriett, Baldwin. I sometimes think she won't mind if we end up with 4 nuclear deterrent submarines, and that's all we've got, because that'd be wonderfully symbolic. But actually, for the jobs that we need frigates, we need deployable marines, we need people who can deal with situations as they arise. And just one other thing, I note from the NAO report that the arrival of carrier aircraft strike groups is regarded as an absolute revolution in the Navy, that we will have to have half a dozen frigates in every extended carrier strike group. In other words, the majority of our available frigates will be in these carrier groups, and particularly if, as one senior officer said to me, we intend to sail them through the Malacca Straits, you'll need some backup as well, so we'll be even shorter. Why on earth we should want to sail them through the Malacca Straits, I don't know, but that's what they think we're going to do. It'll show we're global Britain, I suppose. That's the symbolic dimension of it. So, yes, we have real problems, and that is why we clearly need an SDSR, and why actually the sheer scale of the long-term equipment programme, which we currently have on board, is probably not sustainable.
May I refine to the personnel issue and ask you, Harriett Baldwin, because you've said there is no further review in the manifesto. You've implied there won't be one, and yet clearly the biggest problem that one understands about putting those new carriers into operation is getting enough people with the right grades, engineering and other grades, to actually operate them. It's a huge problem. And we know, for example, from Deborah Hayne's reporting, that the Army is well below 82,000, and getting it to 82,000 now seems to be regarded as an aspiration rather than actually the target it was meant to settle at. How big a crisis do you think you're dealing with on the personnel front, and doesn't that alone necessitate an urgent look after the election, should you win?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, if Lord Wallace hears me talking about the equipment more than about the people, it's because that's my portfolio as a minister. And obviously we have another minister for the armed forces, another for the people side of things. But the crew for the Queen Elizabeth, the first of the aircraft carriers, is stood up under Captain Jerry Kidd and ready to go again very soon, as they say. And during 2015, the year that I've got the numbers in front of me for, we had our 30,000 sailors.
There is also now a frigate basically being put into light preservation and a landing ship.
It's really important that people understand that we do need to have frigates, partly to protect the submarines, but also, of course, the carrier strike groups which are being built up. And so clearly, one of the reasons that we're now growing the size of the armed forces is to ensure that we have the right number of people at the right time for all of our operational requirements, of course.
I asked the Minister, off the record, how we were going to manage to have the numbers of frigates for our carrier strike forces, to which he said, well, the frigates don't necessarily all have to be British. They can come from our allies. Well, that takes us straight back to the question, what continuing relationship are we going to have with our European allies, or are we just going to hope that the Americans will keep
I think
alongside?
you're confusing EU and NATO there very much. But
and
you know,
he was speaking off the record.
A minister.
But this is illustrative, I think, that we have an outdated SDSR, we have a changed, political and strategic and security situation, in part because a weak and unstable Tory government took us into a referendum to deal with a localized problem that they had within their own party and the extreme right. And now we are in a situation where a majority voted for something that is going to profoundly change our place in the world and our ability to underpin security, which is the first business of government. Now, there may be some very good things that come out of a recognition that our place in the world is changing, has changed, and we need to work towards cooperative security. But the fact is that all of these questions coming up are because this government has not thought it through, doesn't know what it's doing, hasn't looked at the figures, hasn't looked at the changes, and the Defence Secretary hasn't even bothered to come here, and this is the primary defence debate for this 2017 election. And I think that's shocking, and I hope you do too.
Thank you. Larissa Brown from the Daily Mail. I'd just like to turn on to the issue of Northern Ireland and ask each of you what you would do to stop Northern Ireland veterans going through the same relentless, baseless legal claims that Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have. And Nia, your leader yesterday refused 5 times to condemn the IRA bombings, and he's refused to again this morning. And I'm just wondering, would you unequivocally condemn the IRA bombings? Thank you.
Nia.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to speak for my leader, but I can certainly tell you, as somebody who's old enough to remember the troubles in Northern Ireland and who had friends who actually served in Northern Ireland, I absolutely, unequivocally condemn IRA bombings in Northern Ireland. And in terms of our service personnel who served there, no way should they be subject to vexatious claims, long drawn-out processes, referring back to times which actually, in many instances, have already been dealt with and have already been examined fully. So what we need in Northern Ireland now, we need to move forward. We need to move forward with a process, a continuing peace process, because even today, as we speak, things are not settled in Northern Ireland. There are still tensions and anxieties, and what we need is a proper process that will deal with the legacy issues so that we can move forward for the future there.
Northern Ireland, Harriett.
Well, thank you very much for your question, and obviously we will continue to do whatever we can to ensure that the people who served our country by serving in Northern Ireland are not subject to the kind of legal hounding that we have seen. And in terms of the IRA, obviously I am very happy to unequivocally condemn terrorism wherever it comes from, and personally find it deeply shocking that one of the 2 people who could be Prime Minister on the 9th of June actually stood in support of the people who bombed us in the Conservative Party conference in Brighton in the early 1980s.
This gentleman, I think this is probably going to be the last question, unless it elicits one-word answers from the panel.
There's been a lot of discussion about whether you want another SDSR. The fact is, you've all acknowledged this, the forces rely on their people. They are below strength at the moment. There are many senior officers asking, why is it people don't seem to want to join? Why is it so many people want to leave? And what would you do about that?
Excellent question. Good question. But Wallace, do you want to?
Yeah, well, we've clearly got to improve pay and conditions and ways of retaining them. We've come out with these proposals about a bonus when you join and extra assistance when you've stayed for 10 years. That helps. But I think clearly, particularly for the most skilled areas, pilots and and engineers, we're going to have to think about current pay rates. But I mean, part of the problem we know we've got in the armed forces at the present moment, as we've been hearing from here, is that people don't know quite what they're there for. They don't feel particularly loved, and they don't really know what the strategy is about. And every time I listen to Boris Johnson make a speech, I'm quite clear I don't know what the strategy is about either. So getting a government that has a rather clear idea of our capabilities and of what we want to do, and that puts more money into personnel as well as equipment, that's what we need.
Personnel are clearly a vital issue. I'm going to ask each of you, this is very invidious, it's a one-word answer, but I think we've heard a lot from the floor about the need to balance and the affordability. I'm going to ask each of you, starting at your end of the platform, Lord Wallace, in a word, what would you do less of as part of a SGSR that would follow a general election?
I mean, that's why we would have a review, because there were some very uncomfortable, there are some very uncomfortable choices.
Brendan,
my party.
I think I know your word, and it begins with T. But
Yeah, absolutely. Cut Trident and invest in conventional defences properly.
Rebecca?
I'd scrap Trident, and I'd really look at the arms sales to oppressive regimes that deny human rights. We should not be reducing the unit cost of our weaponry by selling to regimes that use them on their own people, and then our own services end up facing some of our weapons that we sold. So let's deal with those things.
Nia?
Less lining of the pockets of private entrepreneurs by outsourcing. That means bringing back into house things that we can do better in-house, so that we get the food that we want for our armed forces and that we get the services that we want, and we're not lining pockets of profit-making tycoons.
Harriett, you've had a long time to think about it. So we expect something very incisive.
I'm going to stick to one word. I'm going to say litigation.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all very much. Now, I have to advertise on the 30th of May, there will be the RUSI Foreign Affairs debate, and on the 2nd of June, the Home Affairs debate. So you can have a chance to keep going in the election spirit here for the next couple of weeks. And I hope that on behalf of all of us, I can thank the panel, and I hope you'll all join me in giving them a warm round of applause. Thank you so much. And thank you for your questions.